Okay, we've lost a couple of people who had afternoon meetings, so that means you get more personalised attention. All right, those numbers are down. I'm only going to introduce one more framework, all right? And this is kind of like the uniting framework. I mean, there are other things I can talk about, like flexures curves, but I think there's a limit to how much we can throw at you, right? We've actually put the hexakit assembly for knowledge mapping here. So that shows you us putting different methods together in different combinations into what's called an assembly. So what I'm going to do is get this final framework done up until the coffee break, and after the coffee break, it's open forum. So if you find a hexi which sounds interesting, you can ask a question about that. I'll go through that. If you want to go back over other stuff or think about the implications, we'll do that, right? So the final session is going to be kind of like open. It's not long, but we'll take it on. I think it goes to 4, don't we?
4 something.
Yeah. So. And the break will be about 3:10. So that's going to be about half an hour. So I'm going to do the framework up to then and go on from that. Okay. And I'm going to try and give you an exercise on this as well. Yeah. So the basic principle on this is that if you are going to intervene in a system, the granularity of the intervention matters. So if I commit the whole of the organization's resources to make something work, that's a coarsely grained intervention. If I do lots of small things and see what works, that's a finely grained intervention. I'm not saying either are right or wrong, but that's my horizontal dimension. And then we get the difference on emergence. So remember, emergent properties arise as things interact over time, and the emergent properties can't be deduced from the properties of the parts. Yeah? So you've got two options. One is you just let things happen and respond. Yeah, I mean, that means you're going to monitor for it, but if interesting things start to happen, you can respond when they happen. That's really risk-free, but may not be dynamic enough. The other is you try and force emergence, yeah, by highly structured interventions or by things like market research. So you try and work out what is actually happening. So that gives me two dimensions of a simple matrix: granularity of intervention against how you treat emergence. And what this is going to build to is to say that strategy and risk need to be a portfolio. Yeah, because finely grained is less risk, coarse grained is higher risk, natural emergence is low risk, forced emergence is high risk. Yeah, so actually you can't just decide a strategy in isolation. You actually need a portfolio of strategic initiatives which recognize those different spaces. Remember I said earlier, everybody understands portfolios. This is quite a good introduction. Okay? So I'm going to show you a really nice picture which our graphic designers have put together, but I'll start off with a really ugly picture, which is me drawing it to build it. By the way, there's evidence on this. If I teach at the University of Sophia Antipolis in southern France, they have blackboards and chalk. I love that. I've got 3 roller blackboards, so I've effectively got 9 workspaces which I can run over a week. What chalk does is it slows you down, so you have to pay attention to the audience. These things do something similar. So it's not neat and tidy, but you follow it, and then we give you the neat and tidy version. Yeah? If you just flash fully prepared slides, people don't absorb it in the same way. So that's partly why I'm doing this. But my handwriting is not good. Dyslexics develop bad handwriting to disguise bad spelling. All right? It's the way it works. So if I take those 2 dimensions, what I've got here is, here I have emergence, and here I have granularity. So this is fine-grained, and this is coarse-grained. Right, so that's the intervention type. Here I have natural emergence, and here I have stimulated emergence. Sorry?
More self-organization down.
Yeah, you're going to see that coming in a
More
minute.
directed.
Yeah, you got it. So it's like, you know, if you take the children's party, which is a famous story I created, if you bounce a ball, you're stimulating emergence. You're seeing if a pattern will play or form around that. If you just let the kids randomly do things, yeah, then that's natural emergence. Okay? Now, that gives me a really interesting dimension. And what I'm going to also do is to say that based on the strategy, there will be different risk mitigation strategies in place. And rather nicely, that picture is the international symbol for chaos. So that actually kind of has a side benefit. Yeah? So if I look at this, this is what I'll call conventional strategy. Right? We do market research, we stimulate the environment, we ask questions, we decide what the right thing is to do, and then we commit our resources. Right? So that's reasonably familiar, nothing wrong with that, within certain boundaries. Over here, this is more entrepreneurial, so this is opportunistic. Which basically means if something starts to emerge, I throw all my resources because I think that's the right thing to do. And this is actually what entrepreneurs do. And the reason it works well is you've got lots of entrepreneurs doing it, so you can afford a high rate of failure. Yeah? So that's basically opportunistic. When something emerges, we commit all our resources because we want to make it work. Nothing wrong with that, yeah? But it's also risky in other ways. Yeah? Over here, this is where we can, and I haven't quite made up my mind what to call this one yet, but the best way I've thought about it, is to think about it in effect, I was just checking the name, right, as hypothesis-based. So at this space, we've done market research, we've got people involved, but there are multiple competing hypotheses. In fact, a better name for it, which I might change the thing to, is I've got conflicting hypotheses. This is classic conflict in large organizations. There are different theories about what's happening and what we should do. You can't resolve those conflicts on an evidence base in the time frame you've got for decision. Now, that's one of the definitions of complexity, by the way, is you have competing hypotheses about what to do, and you can't resolve which is the right way on an evidence base in the time frame to make a decision. So time impacts. Now, that's one of the simplest ways of defining it. And then we get this really interesting area, yeah, which actually requires distributed intelligence. So that's the basic framework. Yeah, sorry, gone away from that. It's the basic framework. It says we got these 4 domains. Yeah, they have different approaches to actually evidence-based, to hypotheses, to interventions. And of course, you may then get very different profiles. And I'll show you one, and I'll show you more in a second. So you could almost argue that a current organization probably looks something like this. Right, that's the pattern of what they do. They're sometimes opportunistic, but most of the time they're committing resources. Now, that's probably one of the highest risk strategies under conditions of uncertainty. You won't find companies yet, but I think this is the future, or countries whose profile looks more like this. And then shifts things in that direction once they know what's going on. Right, so this is kind of like an old model, new model type process. Okay, so let's give you the pretty picture. This now looks a lot nicer, doesn't it? All right. I'm actually really pleased with this. It's really pleased with it. All right. But it took about a year to get this right, and lots of negotiations between Anna and myself. All right. So, Anna, so you can see what I've got here is the fine grain, the coarse grain, the stimulated, the natural. But now let's now look, yeah, at the risk mitigation strategies. So this is pulling together a lot of what I've talked to you about. So if you have directed, which I've forgotten, that's the name we agreed, not conventional, right? Anna won that argument, I lost that one, so that's the right answer. I talked about mass sense, which I'll talk you through in a second, right? Because I want to do the foresight stuff. The way mass sense works is I actually put, this is my analysis of the world, this is what I plan to do. I put that in an infographic, I distribute it to my entire workforce and say, what do you think is happening, what do you think will happen over the next 3 horizons? Everybody know about 3 horizons in foresight? Oh, you look forward over 3 time horizons, short term, medium term, long term. And it's problematic in many ways, but I use it here. And I actually gather the input from all of my employees about what's going on. So I can see if there's mass dissent on this, or there are minority views, I may be getting it wrong. So the mass sense capability is a way of pre-proofing, once I've formulated something, is this sustainable? Because actually, even if I'm right, if none of my employees believe in it, it probably won't get executed anyway. So I'm starting to build that element into it. Yeah? So that's the use of mass sense. And as I say, I'll show you in a minute the work we're doing, which will go through at least 1 iteration. Downstream, that will be thousands of iterations, but that's a software development. Yeah? So that's risk mitigation there. Risk mitigation, bottom left, that's where you create human sensor networks. You remember I talked about employees replacing reports with continuous reporting? Yeah? And in both of these cases, I don't just have to use employees, I can use customers. We got a provisional agreement with the Pulitzer Institute in the States to use their journalists. Yeah? We're talking with universities at the moment about creating a network of universities who will sell us their doctoral students as a sensor network. Because we can pay them quite a lot of money for 10 minutes of their time because of the value. So what we're moving towards on this is to build libraries of sensor networks which you can then actually use to monitor for emergence or to test. But the more that's a continuous Gemba type operation, you can trigger alerts. The other thing you can do there, and this is a good use of AI, is you can look at examples of projects in the past which have succeeded and failed, or products, or strategies. You then gather all the data which was available to people in the build-up to that event. Yeah? And then what you then do is you don't actually look at the problem as a whole. You break up all those incidences and you get naive agents, people who don't know the outcome, to index them in SenseMaker. Yeah? They don't know whether it was a good outcome, they do it. That gives me a training data set. I can then use that with an algorithm to actually monitor incoming data from people's daily reports and trigger an alert which says the pattern of micro reports matches the pattern of micro reports on a previous success, so this is where I should pay attention. And that's called an anticipatory trigger. So again, that's the use of networked intelligence to build anticipation into the system, and that's a good use of AI because we know what the training data sets were constructed around. And we can construct them around customers and everything else. So that's an example of mitigating risk and increasing our ability to spot opportunities as they come in. All of this is fractal, by the way. It might be grand strategy from a country, or it might be organizational change for a department. It doesn't really make much difference. Yeah, the problems are very similar. In hypothesis-based, well, that's kind of like where we have the classic Cynefin approach, is you identify all the hypotheses, you test them for coherence. You're not going to waste time on incoherent hypotheses. Yeah? And then you run safe defect experiments in parallel around each of the hypotheses and see what happens. Yeah? So that's a risk mitigation device in that environment. That's also conflict resolution. Yeah? And then we get the really exciting stuff, which is down here, which is actually, and this is where I talked about distributed decision making. Remember I talked about combinations of 3, 5, or 7 roles being allowed to spend small amounts of money, yeah, without actually asking for approval, and you see what works and doesn't work. That's what you do down here. And that's the really exciting area, because you're not actually trying to guess what's the right thing to do. You're seeing what actually worked at scale, and you're amplifying the good things and dampening the bad things. Yeah? So that, from our point of view, is really important, because what that actually does is it creates a dynamic environment in which strategy itself will emerge from that substrate. Yeah? So instead of actually having to go into the top right first, you go down and then come up. And by the way, that will take less time than a traditional strategy process. Strategy processes normally take about a year or 2 years to put together, because you've got lots of consultations, lots of meetings, lots of whatever, all right? This is cheaper, easier, faster, and more reliable. And so it builds on those inset models. The other thing, if you look at it, I've got the ordered complex divide there. So basically, that's actually the principle. On that side, it's complex. You don't know in advance what the right thing to do. On the other side, it's ordered, so you've got knowledge. So that sort of ties the frameworks together. Yeah? Now, that also allows me to look at different profiles. Yeah? So this is kind of like when I first stabbed at this. So the conventional side is very heavily focused on order, yeah, and not emergence, which is natural in that sense. Cynefin informed, that's where we've been historically, which says multiple hypotheses, test them, move them into traditional strategy. So that's the Cynefin complex to order domain. But then you get this radical emergence where you're mixing that sort of stuff with this distributed intelligence. So you're actually, by interventions, changing the substrate in your favor. Yeah, before you commit resources. Now again, anybody who manages children knows about this stuff intuitively. There's nothing in here that we don't do in our day-to-day lives. We're just sort of formalizing and structuring at scale. So that framework is called RAS. Yeah. This is another example. This is kind of like where I'm going on this. Is say what you really want is to populate these areas and then see what emerges before you commit. Yeah? The name of that is RAS, which stands for Weaving Risk and Strategy Together. There is an internal debate at the moment about whether we make it WRASSE, because that's a really interesting fish. And it's easier to pronounce. So there is a sort of marketing debate going on at the moment about whether we add an S and E to it. So I'm interested in ideas on that. Yeah? RAS is a very interesting fish, so we can make a metaphor on it. Yeah?
What would it stand for if you added the S and E?
That's what we're playing with. I've actually asked AI to come up with some ideas on that. And it's come up, so weaving risk and strategy together to stimulate something, intervention. Yeah. There's lots of emergence, right? So there's lots of things you can play with it. So, I mean, to be honest, I've done this all my life because my role, I'm a methodologist, all right? I like theory, I like practice. For my entire life, I've developed methods that other people can use. That's what I do, right? And the key thing is acronyms become really important because they make things memorable. Yeah?
The European Patent Office at one time had this program called PEST, bringing examination and search together.
Yeah, that's it.
They did something with the team. You could think about
yeah, no, I'm working on that, all right? But I say, Anna and I now have an antagonistic debate on this rather than a friendly debate, so I've withdrawn for the moment, all right? But I'll come back.
A version that you talk about the sweet point, why you call it sweet point.
Yeah. Yeah, that was an early phrase, all right? We've now got rid of that.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, that's what happens when you have theory, you try it out. Right. You try it out, you explain it, then one day it comes together. So this is now stable, which is why we've labeled it. And it's now got its own hexi card in the new strategy kit.
Also, I have a question about Aporia.
Yeah.
I think Aporia can be around also, it can be sometimes in the middle, going in the middle, right? If we have
It's gone. Oh.
Aporatic can be sometimes when you are
It can be, but I've inverted it this time. So what I basically said, and thank you for pointing out because I'd forgotten that if I take this, if I go too far in any of these directions, I need to think again. So what I'm doing is, in Cynefin terms, if I go too far, I put myself back into the center, and I can migrate from that. Yeah. It also made for a much prettier picture if we put it on the outside than the center. Yeah. Sorry, aesthetics matter. If you've done theoretical physics, you know aesthetics matter. When an equation looks beautiful, you know it's right. Okay. Sorry, but it's actually true, all right, if you think about it, all right? E equals mc squared is just wonderfully elegant. So yeah, but you could put it on the center. I mean, you could make a three-dimensional one of this where you come back to the center and go out. So that's making apparatic three-dimension. Yeah, it is. Yeah, it's dynamic. I've experienced your small questions already, so I shall get ready for a major one, all right? That's if you believe Roger Martin.
Yes, you're totally right. So it's a bunch of hypotheses, the strategy itself, which is the direct one. So both ends, to me, almost one.
They can be, but they're not. If you look at, I mean, first of all, I don't agree with Roger that a strategy is always one to win. That is a very classic North American concept. The strategy may be to survive. You may survive better by not winning, but working with winners, for example. So I think there's a danger on that, right? And certainly if you're a government, you're not there to win. You're meant to supply stuff to your citizens, all right? It's a different framework. You can't take industrial models and apply them to government because the controlling mechanisms are different. Right? And that's important. If we haven't realized that with the market economy and NHS in Britain, you should realize it now. It doesn't work. Yeah? Because it's not regulation. Remember I talked about that earlier. Scarcity requires cooperation. Plenty allows for competition. Right? So I actually need to put scarcity and plenty on this as well as what you would do. I think the difference, and I mean, Simon Wardley and myself, Martin may actually produce a Hexi kit. We're talking with them at the moment. I would work more with Mintzberg, who's closer to complexity, because Mintzberg really understands emergence. And I would say Martin is a good example of the top right, because he basically says there are options and choices, but once you make them, you commit to them. Right? Whereas actually, if you look at Mintzberg argues you should hold things as open for long as possible before you commit, which is much more where we are on the left-hand side of that, which is multiple safe-to-fail experiments before you commit. Yeah? Now, where Roger would place himself or not, I don't know, but there is going to be discussion shortly, so we shall see. All right?
So then Michael Porter will be the
yeah, it is.
Very well.
And one of the reasons I need to get, I got taken apart by a bunch of academics in the States recently and said, you've got to write the complexity book on strategy because we need an alternative to Porter. So Porter is effectively the strategist of systems thinking and order. That's what he's brilliant at. And I basically said, this was 10 years ago, I'm not ready to write it yet. With that, I am. Right? Because that pulls virtually everything I've taught over the last week together into something which is simple enough for an executive to get it, and has that concept of portfolio and risk reduction woven into it. And the weave concept is important. We use those sort of metaphors a lot in complexity. You know, the weft and the weave. Yeah, as you weave things together, the whole is different from the parts, and you can't unweave it without difficulty and so on. So it's quite a strong metaphor, is the fabric one.
Is there any possibility that you give us example for each one?
Yeah, okay, so when Lou Gerstner took over my company, Data Sciences, is actually a good example because basically the consultants were advising him to break up IBM's portfolio. The fashion at that time was strategic focus. Gary Hamel, by the way, is a good weather vane of fashion because whatever is fashionable, Gary Hamel publishes a book about it. So he's now talking about distributed decision making, then he was talking about single focus. Right? Now Gerstner didn't do that. Gersonner placed 5 safe-to-fail bets. He bought 5 companies in each of IBM's major business areas who were highly competent in that area. We were a service sector. We became IBM Global Services, which is now 60% of IBM, if not more. Yeah, but he knew that IBM couldn't develop a service company, so he bought a company with service management and experience and basically consolidated. He bought Lotus. That didn't work. Software didn't change. Right? So that's a good example. I mean, okay, he paid twice what we thought we were worth, which was quite good of those of us who were management buyer. But fundamentally, from his point of view, buying, billion-dollar purchases of companies was a safe-to-fail experiment. He also made a big bet top right. He did both. And I worked with Gersonner a lot on strategy after he got to know me, which is a story. So I'll tell you that story. So there was a conspiracy to have me fired in IBM. I really wasn't popular in the consultancy group. And they actually concocted something. You don't realize how nasty big companies are. I finally left because a senior director forged an email to me. And I could prove he forged it. All right? If you want to do difficult things, just prepared for nastiness. All right? So they basically had evidence, and they went in to get me fired. The trouble is, half an hour before, he'd opened a personal letter to him, inviting him to an invitation-only executive seminar on leadership run by Peter Drucker and David Snowden of IBM. And he'd written on it, "Who is this person who works for me? Get them over here tomorrow." And then half an hour later, a group of people came in to try to get me fired, and he almost fired them. It was quite interesting, right? But that was one of those days when you're lucky, right? But what Gersonner also did, which was strategic, and sorry, I make these stories so you know just how nasty it gets. And I remember once being told, "Why are you taking this personally? You were just roadkill." Yeah, big companies tend to be amoral, not immoral. And being amoral is a lot more dangerous than being immoral, because it's indifference. Yeah? But what he did, which saved IBM, is he betted a huge investment on the next generation of mainframes. Because he said, we can be the only player in a legacy market, and that's high profit. And that saved IBM. Because all the world's banks run off IBM mainframes. Yeah, because that's the way it works. So that would be an example there, right? Example bottom right, as I said, at the moment, that's markets. So anybody read Lean Startup? Okay, this is one of the 2 worst books ever published in Agile, right? The worst one is Reinventing the Organization. So Reinventing the Organization by Lacroix chooses evidence to support his hypothesis and ignores evidence from the same companies which disprove the hypothesis. Now, it really scares me people take books like that seriously. But Lean Startup, he goes and studies a whole bunch of very successful startup companies in the US, and he interviews their CEOs. And from that, he publishes a book called Lean Startup, which says this is what you need to do to be successful. Now, there are several major problems with that approach. First of all, he only studies success. He doesn't understand failure, doesn't study failure. Secondly, he believes what successful people tell him after they were successful, which we know is not the case. And third, he forgets it's a market. We did similar research with Dorothy Leonard of Harvard when I was in IBM, and we studied companies who failed as well as companies who succeeded. We found everything in Lean Startup was done by the failing companies as well as the successful companies. There was hardly any difference in what they did. The difference is some succeeded and some failed, because there were so many actors, some were bound to succeed. Right? So there's a whole bunch of work by a friend of mine, Mac at Wharton, which actually works on how do you create intrapreneurial culture. Because intrapreneurs are not the same thing as entrepreneurs. Entrepreneurs work in a market which can afford massive failure. Companies can't work entrepreneurial because they can't afford that rate of failure. So there's a whole literature which is worth reading on intrapreneurship. Some of our methods, which I've just talked about, are about creating intrapreneurship capabilities in the organization. Yeah? And there's none in the bottom left because we've only just invented that. Yeah?
So I have a question about
Yeah, cooperation.
Yeah, for cooperation. My question relates to efficiency, like a component. What is in long term or in like what happened in the United States? Some companies they established their like their companies outside the country.
Yeah.
So in the long term, they don't help the country with the capabilities.
But they're more resilient. It's less efficient, but it's more effective.
Yeah.
So, for example, one of the things I've argued, and I've done a lot of work strategy with Pfizer, with Novartis, with AstraZeneca, is I've basically said you need to keep more than one research facility. You can't have everything consolidated in one. So the consultants want to consolidate everybody working on oncology in one research centre to get economies of scale. And I say you need 2 or 3 smaller units because you need the diversity. So one of the major mistakes the US made after 9/11 is they consolidated everything into one agency. And that reduced the level of scanning. You need different groups working from different bases. So we argue very strongly, if you want to be effective in an uncertain world, you need to be inefficient. Yeah? You need to have redundancy. If you over-focus on efficiency, you over-optimize for the context as you currently understand it, and you've lost adaptive capacity. Yeah? If you actually focus on inefficiency, and this is a necessary limit on that, we can mathematically measure this, by the way. Brasso and I worked out how to do that. What level of inefficiency do you need to have in order to be effective under different conditions of uncertainty? Now, anybody in contingency planning knows this. Anybody in military environments knows this. You have massive redundancy in the system because you don't know what you'll need until you need to know it. Yeah? And that's something companies need to address. These sort of matrices are about making people aware of that. Not to say it's universal, but to say in this context, so in ordered areas you focus on efficiency, in complex areas you focus on effectiveness. Yeah, robustness against resilience, the point I made yesterday.
How about the conflict between people who are looking for short term and other groups who are looking for?
Well, it depends what industry you're in as well, all right? So if you're in FMCG, everything is short term. Now, I often argue you can actually work out the strategic timescale for a company by the average lead time of spare parts. Right? So if you work in the aerospace industry, the lead time on spare parts is 15 years. Right? Whereas if you work in high street retail, the lead time is 4 days. And that tells you a lot about the culture of those companies and how they make decisions. Right? So I think that issue about, and that's a replenishment cycle. So your ability to reinvent yourself and replenish yourself determines the time horizon to some extent of what you have to do strategically. Any more on that? Cool. So that allows me to come and finish off with changing from foresight to forethought. Yeah? Now this is kind of like building back on this matrix, but it's also building on S-stream mapping. It says foresight is deeply problematical. So if you look at it, we have forecasting. So that's trying to predict the future state. You then have backcasting. So this came about, I always find this rather amusing. People said forecasting is too pessimistic, so we want a new method. And it was like, if forecasting is too pessimistic, maybe you should address the problem, right? But backcasting was define the future state and then try and close the gap. This seems, if I look, I've tried desperately to find evidence of it working outside the workshop where it was created. So it's an extremely effective workshop technique because people come out feeling really good about life, but I don't see any changes. We focus on what's called side casting. Yeah, well, this is me getting angry again. Somebody from Singapore phoned up and said, we want a training course in that backcasting technique. I said, we don't do backcasting. He said, what do you do first? And nothing like adrenaline. I said, we sidecast. And then over the next 3 days, wrote a wonderful set of blogs using fly fishermen as a metaphor, because actually I suddenly realized that's what they do. They cast around to see what's possible. Yeah? So S-line mapping is a sidecasting technique. Yeah? Now, there are several interesting questions and deficiencies. Yeah? So I need to find my notes on this. Not because I don't know the subject, but there is actually a book chapter I'm going to send you, which is going to be published next year. And I won't want to tell you with consistently what I wrote when I wrote it in the book chapter, all right? Which I think I've got here. This is now which notebook I wrote it in. This is a problem. No, it's not Poly. It's a new one. I've got it somewhere. I wrote it for a seminar the other day. Sorry, I have a notebook fetish, a stationery fetish. Give me a stationery store. I've got loads of notebooks at home because I bought because they're beautiful and I don't want to use them, all right? My daughter shares the same problem. If I don't get it, I'll just do it from memory. No, I've written it somewhere else. So I'll do this from memory, all right, but the chapter will update it. If you look at foresight techniques, which include things like scenario planning, and the article is in the new book coming out on scenario planning, and I'm the, it doesn't work per chapter, right? It works in some context. First of all, it has a bias towards prediction. Yeah? It also has a bias towards the dominant theories. I've done a lot of scenario planning in Singapore. I'm one of the designated mavericks. Neil Stephenson is another, if anybody knows Neil Stephenson. Okay, he's a brilliant science fiction writer. Yeah, absolutely brilliant. Yeah, Baroque trilogy. He and I came up with a perfectly realistic scenario about China 15 years ago, which has now come absolutely true, which was totally dismissed at the time by everybody in government as completely unrealistic. So the other problem with scenario planning is that coherent but unacceptable solutions get dismissed. It's not just about creating the scenario. Secondly, scenario planning takes too much time. Yeah, and all you do is you get a group of specialists together, which is dangerous. Specialists are a nightmare if you're trying to understand complexity. Yeah, and they brainstorm a forces and factors analysis, produce a 2x2 matrix, and write 5 scenarios, which are graphically produced, make a good press release, and then go into the drawers of people and are never used. Interestingly, the Singapore Scenario Planning Office is having real problems now because most ministries don't want to use them because they want more dynamic frameworks. Yeah, so scenario planning was a really good thing to do at government level like 30 years ago, but life is now changing too quickly for that sort of technique, so we need different techniques. Yeah? So all of that gave us to produce a series of alternatives. So for example, the future backwards. This works off a CIA interrogation technique. I hasten to add, this is actually really good to use with young people. And I'm not going to advocate waterboarding, though I think some behavior does justify that. But when your teenage child comes back home, this may not happen here, but it happens here at 2 o'clock in the morning, and you want to kill them because they've given you stress, but you want to hug them because they're alive, and they produce this wonderful story about why they're late, which is called an alibi in police circles. And it's wholly coherent, it's well worked out, you know they're lying. Get them to tell the story backwards. Human beings cannot lie backwards. This is how you test an alibi in the intelligence services. Don't tell me why your life started. Tell me what you did last year, what you did the year before, what you did the year before. Yeah, what did you do the hour before you came back home? What happened 2 hours before that? After 3 iterations, inconsistencies and contradiction will have crept in, and you can decide whether you use them or not, right? The reason for that is telling the story backwards creates a massive cognitive load on the brain, so it starts to scan more data. Okay, now that's a key principle. Yeah? So what we do in Anthro-simulation, which is a game designed for foresight, is we get teams of people who are selected for thinking the same way. So I get 5 teams who are actually patterning trained, because they think the same way. And this is done by human mediation. It takes about 5 days to set up and 2 days to run. Yeah, and you have the 5 teams. You give them a situation and you ask them to come up with a solution. While they're coming up with a solution, you feed them disruptive data. So they don't get a stable situation to assess. They're constantly being fed new data by the human team. We have microphones above each table so we know what we're talking about. And the secret of humans teams seems that I know what I'll do now, I'll tell them this. Right? So after a very disruptive hour, you blow a whistle or bang a gong if you're a trendy California facilitator, but blowing a whistle if you're more into referees, all right? And you say, what you're going to do, give me the paper now. So they hand you a piece of paper, they go away for an hour, they come back, whatever they did turns out to have been a total and utter disaster. Because you can pick something they missed and extrapolate from that. Repeat twice more. By this time they're starting to realize they're doomed to failure. Some of them realized what Star Trek episodes I watched when I was young, because that's where I got the idea, right? If you know Star Trek, you know where I got that from. I can never pronounce it, right? But what happens, and we've done this, it's been published by Gary Klein, myself, and Joe Chung, is by the end of that process, people are scanning 20 times more data than at the start. Because if you consistently fail, you scan more data. If you succeed, you scan less. And what we do during an Anthro-simulation is we capture stories continuously from the participants about what they think and what they're doing when they don't know the outcome. And that creates a massive narrative database we can use in a real crisis. Right? So we're not just using simulation as a training exercise. Now that's an example of a different approach to foresight. You put the problem into a space with people from different backgrounds, you effectively create a war game environment. You make sure that people fail, but you're building narrative so that when you hit that situation, you've got multiple strategies available to you, and you've got warnings about possible pathways for failure. The first one we did on this in Singapore was a lot of fun. You don't know, Singapore has a meritocratic educational system, and they have a phenomenon there called president scholars. Now, president scholars are really, really scary. One of the ones I know, his first degree was engineering from MIT, his master's degree was cognitive psychology from Stanford, and his doctorate was philosophy of art from Cambridge. Did all of that by the time he was 30. Yeah, that's what president scholars are like, right? And they run the Singapore civil service. Don't just look at the Singapore model, look at what their educational system produces to make it work. Yeah, the elite go into the civil service and they are paid so much money that if they're ever caught for corruption, they're in prison straight away. Lee Kuan Yew said that we mustn't have corruption. Yeah? So either way, so we had a president scholars group because Peter Ho, who was head of the civil service then, who was also an ex-president scholar, said they're arrogant, I want them disrupted. So old and wise can always disrupt young and bright, all right? We're cunning, as they say. So we had a president scholars group, we had a group of sergeants from the army who actually won the game in the end. They failed at least worse than anybody else. We had intelligence, so we had different ministries and different groups. And we set up a situation which was a counter-terrorist situation, and we started to feed them data. And my entire goal was to actually effectively confuse the president scholars so that they went down the wrong pathway. So we started to feed them data, about dirty bombs in cities on national days. Rumours of an attack on Bastille Day in Paris. So they started to think about National Day in Singapore. Then we hijacked a hospital waste ship in the Malacca Straits, which of course has got all the material for a dirty bomb. So now they're absolutely convinced that that's where they focused. In the meantime, we pumped cholera-contaminated feces into the reservoirs in Singapore, and we killed 1 million people on the independent assessors. And we'd already told them that terrorists were checking in type A blood group densities in Singapore, and they missed it. Because type A is resistant to cholera, type O isn't. Right? And the story they told at the end of how they killed 1 million people by arrogance is still shown in the Civil Service College. Yeah? Now, you see what we're doing? Let's try mapping maps reality. Anthro-simulation creates multiple realities based on different perspectives and different actions. Yeah? And as I say, I've taken you through mass sense. present a problem, get everybody to respond to the problem, look at different responses, and then basically represent parts of the problem to different groups and different patterns until you get consensus. Right? All of those are using distributed intelligence, not a centralized agency. Yeah? And the final thing to tell you about, and then kind of like we'll stop, one of the techniques we use to bring different disciplines together, because that's also a key aspect of foresight and complexity management, is how do I bring people from different backgrounds together so I can synthesize different knowledge bases. Now this is far more important now than it was 30 years ago because we don't have many generalists left. Yeah? So this is called a triopticon. Yeah? It has very formalized roles. We originally developed this in British Columbia, so we use hide-a-folk archetypes. So we have eagles, ravens, beavers, coyotes, and owls. Right? This makes it a bit more fun, and we can give people badges to say you're an eagle, you're a raven. Yeah? So eagles soar over the world and see things from a great height. Ravens are curious. Beavers get things done. Coyotes disrupt things, and owls are wise and record things. So that's the roles we have in it. Yeah? So let me give you an example. You want to be so we did the AstraZeneca one, which was AI specialists, clinical specialists, and commercial people. We knew those groups didn't have ways to talk with each other. They had different knowledge bases. But I'll explain in an academic setting because it's easier. So you want, for example, to bring together anthropology, physics, and biology, which, believe it or not, is something which actually is quite powerful. Yeah? So what I do is I find the professor in each discipline in the university who is the most respected professor, which generally means the most arrogant professor. Yeah? The leader in their field, the deep specialist, and I have 3 of those, they're eagles. I can go to 5 or 7, but I'll do it with 3. So I have 3 eagles. I then get them to actually select 7 of their master's students, not PhD students because they're too close to the professor, and not undergraduates, they don't know enough. Masters is a Goldilocks solution, it's just right. So they bring along 7 master's students. Yeah? So what then happens in round 1, Professor 1 presents, Professors 2 and 3 respond. No dialogue is allowed. Now this is actually really important. If you don't allow people to ask questions or to actually discuss things, they listen better. If you actually know you can say something, you're listening for the entry, for your input, you're not listening. So we ritualize that. Nobody's allowed to question anything. Professor 1 speaks 40 minutes, Professors 2 and 3 respond 20 minutes, and they're encouraged not to be nice to each other, which generally doesn't need much encouragement. Yeah? What then happens is the 3 groups of 7 become 7 groups of 3. So one master's student from each of the discipline go out in a small group and discuss what they've heard. Remember that number 3 in compromise? They then come back, and Raven 1, who's actually the master's student from the Professor 1, they all sit in a circle and they talk about what they've heard, and everybody else can only listen, including the professors, which really irritates them. It's very good for them, by the way, because they hear how their ideas were interpreted without a chance for them to correct them. This can be really powerful as a leadership development technique, by the way, right? Really powerful. And then after 2 more rounds, so next round, Professor 2 presents, 1 and 3 respond, Eagles 2 and Ravens 2 and so on. The 7 groups of 3 become 3 groups of 7. They're now a beaver group, they get different badges, and their job is to integrate everything which has happened so far and come up with projects. And the professors can be called in if the beaver groups want to hear their opinion, but not otherwise. Right? Now that is a really, really powerful technique. It took about 4 years to develop because it's a ritualized dance between competing experts. We can run it in an hour to resolve conflict in expert advice to government. So if you remember in COVID, there were massive fights between finance, epidemiology, behavioral sciences. What do I do as an executive because they're all experts? This is a way to resolve that expert debate. And it's a very, very powerful technique in the early stages of a project because it also builds networks between the silos. People have worked together, they live together. So that's another kind of like technique. Now, if you notice, everything I've taught over these 2 days, without any exception, at no point if I said you need people with this mindset, with these attitudes, with these qualities, with these behaviors. I've avoided like the plague, because all behavior is an emergent property of people's interaction over time. It only has causality when it is an entrained pattern, when it's habituated. So this idea that you can observe leaders and say all leaders have this characteristic, so I'll train people to have this characteristic, is fundamentally flawed. It doesn't work like that. And all leaders don't have the same characteristic anyway. I've worked with some of the top CEOs in the world. The only thing they've got in common is they're arrogant bastards who don't believe anybody who disagrees with them, right? But I've yet to see that as a leadership quality in a management textbook, right? But that's the only thing I observed in common between Gersonner, you know, and others, right? So, what I've tried to do is, yeah, it's well, I mean, Gersonner was very different from Jobs, was very different from you know, the guy in GE, who I did strategy for GE for a period. And you know, all CEOs are different because they all arise out of a different context. There isn't a universal model of leadership. Leadership is deeply contextual. Leadership in the army is ritualized. It's not individual, it's role-based. That's really important to realize. You know, role-based leadership is far more effective than individual leadership because you can change the roles and you can change people in roles. Medical always works off role-based leadership. You know, you may have an arrogant consultant surgeon, but they know they're totally dependent on the theatre nurses and the houseman and everybody else. It's always a team, or rather a crew, to be precise. Okay?
How about adaptive leadership? Adaptive leadership.
That was a cute idea from Heivetz, yeah? Yeah, it's a cute idea. It recognized the need of context, but it's still focused on the individual. So it still talked about individual characteristics, if you look at it, right? What we're saying now from cognitive neuroscience, from anthropology, from complexity, is actually you change the actants, you change the interactions. If you get desirable behavior, you reinforce it. Undesirable behavior, you disrupt it. And some things you make so stable. Remember that Ames model? Because actually you can't manage things through behavioralism. I mean, largely, but micro-behavioralism, you know, micro-nudges is totally discredited now if you look at the literature. People have studied all the published papers and actually they've had negligible effect. Yeah, it has an initial Hawthorne effect because it's novel, but then everybody realizes how it's being used and they start to ignore it. Yeah? So, and the other classic mistake on this is to believe that, you know, we need innovation. Innovative people are creative, so we'll run creativity programs. And we convert a room in the office to a children's playground. Yeah, we get people playing with chairs and doing trust exercises and falling backwards off brick walls into the arms of their colleagues. It's complete and utter nonsense. Creativity and innovation are both emergent properties of starvation, pressure, and perspective shift. One doesn't cause the other unless you get somebody who's an artist who becomes creative by habit, at which point it does have causal qualities. But you can't train it. It's habitual. Okay? Right, so you've had a lot thrown at you. Yeah? Any questions before I give you a coffee break? And then the final half hour is going to be free format. Anything else you want to raise?
I saw some video that you changed some terms that related to foresight right now with forethinking.
Yeah.
Is you still with the new term or?
Yeah. In fact, that's the book chapter we'll send you. Right? We'll send it you, but it's not for on circulation. This is artist proof stage, all right? I'm sharing it you to consultation before the final version comes out for publication. I just want to be absolutely clear on that. Be front witnesses and before the camera, right? It's called From Foresight to Forethought. And it basically says you can't have foresight, but you can have preparation. You can think in advance and prepare. Yeah? And that goes through sidecasting techniques. Yeah? There's also the Poli article, which is open access. Yeah, which is, and that's another foresight article. Yeah. Yeah. But since the European Union handbook came out, I've written 4 book chapters. One is in Poli's handbook on foresight, and that deals with assemblage and affordance and agency. Then I wrote the alternative scenario planning, which is forethought, not foresight. And I've just completed one on the future of coaching, which will come out in January. Yeah. And what's the other one I wrote? I've forgotten now. Oh, it was one for so Peter Ho was the permanent secretary at Singapore. He hit 70. He's about 6 months younger than me, and they decided that they got the idea from us because the team put together the Cynefin birthday book for my birthday, and conned me into writing the introduction. I thought I was writing an article, right? So they did something for him. They basically got everybody who he respects as an intellectual to write a chapter on original thinking, and they put it in a book. So I've got a chapter in that, along with some quite impressive people. I'm quite pleased to be in that company. And the book is called Peter Ho's Menagerie. Yeah? Peter Ho's Menagerie. And that's where I wrote up the whole concept of distributed intelligence. So those 4 book chapters complement the EU field guide. The 5th book chapter, which will contain the RAS model, that completes the set. And at that point, I can put the whole thing together in the book. Yeah.
You participated in a conference that related to Beyond Budget.
Yeah,
What is
yeah.
about that?
Oh, that's Beate. I love Beate, all right? Yeah, I mean, there's a phrase on this. You remember the phrase, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas? Whereas a variation on that, what works in Scandinavia stays in Scandinavia. It's a unique culture, right? So, and also, if you go and talk with Statoil, and the executives I've talked to know that they're doing beyond budgeting. But beyond budgeting is a noble cause. It says the budget cycle destroys innovation in companies. So everybody's working on a budgetary basis. Everybody's sort of worried about year end. We create special offers for financial year ends because people want to spend their budgets before the year end. So year end surplus creates a nice little secondary market. And what Beyond his people said is we need to get rid of budgeting. Right? Now my view is that's swinging the pendulum. You have to have budgets. The problem is the granularity of the budgets. Yeah? And I don't think they challenge the organizational structure enough. They're just looking at the finance side. So if you look at our approach, we would have bigger budgets, but smaller amounts of those budgets would go on distributed decision making. So actually allowing people who come together in different combinations to spend small amounts of money at any stage in the year and see what works before you allocate the big money. So I think there are more sophisticated ways of approaching the problem, but I have a huge amount of respect for those guys.
You stand in the middle.
Yeah.
Not become extreme with this side of it.
Well, I stand beneath both. Yeah, it's much better to be beneath, all right? Firing up is better than firing down. Yeah? But no, I mean, the principle is that you guys have swung the pendulum too far.
Right.
Yeah, what they do is they got the timeliness, and the dynamic reallocation of cash can happen with bigger sums. Yeah, you don't want to divide everything up by every budgeting head, but you want more autonomy in the system to make decisions faster. I mean, there's an issue here on transparency, by the way. If you make everything too transparent, nobody will invent anything. So when first time I was a general manager, and this is in the 80s, I could spend £10,000 without getting approval. So I took risks. Gradually, as business process re-engineering came in, I had less and less budgetary authority, so I couldn't take risks. When I joined IBM, the guy I worked for, his rounding error every quarter was $250,000. So if it was less than $250,000, he could round it down to 0. So he could hide people like me. But gradually, IBM control came in to a point where nothing could be hidden, at which point innovation dried up. So no transparency, fraud, too much transparency, static system. Yeah. So one of the things we're trying to do is to change the nature of that process. Any more? Just one quick thing. If anybody wants to play with SenseMaker with real data, we've actually got a thing up on the website called a Quick Sense, which costs you £950. So it's designed to be really cheap, like credit card type purchase. And they're pre-given signifiers. So we've got them for culture, AI readiness, and what else have we got, Jules? Sustainability? Okay. So the ones I would look at is we got one on culture, and there's 2 on those, one for the agile community, one for general. And what they do is they present 6 cartoons. You choose a cartoon which represents your culture. You tell a story. Right? So we will look at making those specific, but those can be played with. The AI one comes from extensive work we've done with AstraZeneca, which has won awards in organizational development, and it measures the attitudes to AI in your organization. Right? So they basically come, you get to use them as often as you want for 3 months, and you get an absolute fixed report. You can pay more and get customization, but it's designed to be download it, play with it, see what it happens, because then your organization gets to see their own narratives. Yeah? So that's something you might want to look at. Next week we'll launch Mass Sense, which will probably be more like 30K. But that's the ability to consult your whole workforce on a current issue in real time with standard reports and services. So we're doing a lot to package this up to make it easier. And to be honest, one of the reasons it costs that much is a CEO will not take something seriously if it doesn't cost a lot of money. So, and we know we'll have to put a lot of services into it. So we are trying to make it easier, right? So those products are up. Yeah? And you've got your local contact here, and we're looking to customize a lot of this into Arabic, etc. Yeah?